struggled with most intensely as an entrepreneur when I did my first company in 2000, and again now that I'm doing another startup now, is giving feedback. It's I think the most important thing you can do to be successful, but also one of the hardest things you can do. Ben Horowitz describes it as sort of an unnatural act, but it's also the atomic building block of management. So this is something that I've given a lot of thought to, and I think I've come up with something that can help both explain why it's so hard, but also make it a lot easier for all of you. So that's what I want to share with you today. In order to explain what I mean by radical candor, I want to just start with a personal story. A story about a time when my boss criticized me in a way that was radically candid and enormously helpful. And I think the story sort of explains both why it's rare and why it's powerful. So after the startup in 2000 failed, I joined Google. And about 2 months after joining Google, at Google I was leading AdSense, online sales and operations. I had to give a presentation to Larry, Sergey, and Eric. And I was, like any normal person in that situation, nervous about the presentation. So nervous that I asked my boss to come with me. And the good news for me was that the AdSense business was on fire. And so when I presented how many new customers we had added over the last couple of months, Eric Schmidt, the CEO, almost fell off his chair. And he said, "What do you need to keep this business miracle alive? Do you need more engineers? Do you need more headcount? What do you need?" So I felt like the meeting had gone reasonably well. In fact, I felt like a genius, right? I thought I had totally nailed it. And so after it was over, I'm walking out the door, and my boss, Cheryl Sandberg, is waiting for me in the doorway, and I'm kind of expecting a high five or some form of congratulations. And instead she says, "Why don't you walk back to my office with me?" And I think, oh shit, I did something wrong. I have no idea what I did wrong, but something didn't go well. So she starts off sort of telling me all the things that did go well, and I'm waiting for the other shoe to drop. And eventually she says to me, "You said a lot. Were you aware of it?" And I just breathed a huge sigh of relief. I was like, if that's all that I did, who cares? I was like, yeah, I know, it's kind of a verbal tick, and no big deal, really. And she said, "Would you like me to get you a speech coach? I know somebody who I think could really help you, and Google will pay for it." And I sort of, again, did this thing with my hand, and I said, we've got millions of customers waiting, pounding down the door of AdSense. I don't really have time for a speech coach. Who really cares? And then Cheryl stops, and she sort of laughs, and she looks at me right in the eye, and she says, "I can tell when you do that thing with your hand that I'm going to have to be a lot more direct to get through to you. When you say every third word, it makes you sound stupid." That got my attention. Cardinal sin. I had been there long enough to know that cardinal sin at Google is stupidity. So I knew I better go see the speech coach. And in fact, when I did, I learned I had to watch a video. This video I will never watch because it's so painful to do it. But I had to watch a video of myself giving a presentation, and Cheryl really wasn't exaggerating. Every third word was And it was like I had a speech impediment I had been unaware of my whole life. And I was not so early in my career. I was, I guess, 36, 37 at the time. And I had given hundreds of presentations in the course of my career. And nobody had had the courtesy to tell me that I had this problem until Cheryl did. It was as though I had been walking around for my entire career with a big chunk of spinach between my two front teeth. And nobody had given me the courtesy to tell me, "Why don't you get that spinach?" Like it's like I couldn't get the spinach out of my teeth. If you told me it's not that hard to get it out. So it made me think a lot about why was it so rare? Why had nobody ever done this for me before? And how was it that Cheryl did it so naturally and so seemingly easily? Although I learned later from her that it didn't come so naturally to her either. This is definitely a learned skill. And what I wanted to do was sort of operationalize what had happened so that I could do it, so that I could teach other people to do it as well, all the people who work for me, and then later on the book. So there were basically two things that Cheryl did that made it natural and effective for her to give me criticism. She cared personally, and she challenged directly, right? Now, that sounds kind of too easy. And it's sort of hard to operationalize that. So what I did was I turned it into a framework, care personally, challenge directly, and I thought about why those two things are rare and what happens if we don't do them, right? So let's start with the vertical axis, the care personally axis. This is also called the give a damn axis. Now, very few people start their careers out thinking, I don't really give a shit about people, so I think I'm going to be a great boss. You know, that's not the way it works, usually. And so what happens? What knocks us down on the give a damn axis? What would cause you not to care about the people who you work with or the people who work for you? And I think this sort of starts along about the time we get our first job, when we're, say, 18, 19, 20. And your ego is a bit fragile, and your persona is beginning to solidify. And just at this moment, you're told to be professional, right? And when you're only professional, it's really hard to care personally, right? So my argument is you've got to be more than just professional. You've got to actually bring your whole self to work. And this was a mantra of Cheryl's at Google, and something that was surprisingly meaningful to people. I remember giving a talk to a group of new employees, and they said to me, you know, what can we do to be successful here? And I said, just show up at work like a human being. And then I felt sort of ridiculous giving that advice. I mean, what were they supposed to do? Show up like squirrels or something? So you know, how can we think about this? Why would you not bring your whole self to work? One of the answers to this question comes in the form of, I've learned about this both with people who work for me and also in my advisory work. It comes in the form of this question. It starts out like with office nonsense, right? So at the very bottom of the axis is not just apathy. It's not like you just don't care about people. It's actually office nonsense. And then comes apathy, and then comes being professional. So when you're merely professional, you're actually on a slippery slope to the office bullshit, right? So at the very least, take the time to give a damn about the people who you work with. Show your basic human decency. And when you're really lucky, you actually get to love the people in an appropriate sense of the word, not a marriage-killing sense of the word. You actually get to love the people you work with. You get to love the work and actually your colleagues as well. And you may as well love them because you spend more time with them than you do with just about anybody else in your life. So it's a high bar. I think sort of common human decency is often enough to get you a long way. But that's what we're shooting for here. Now, unfortunately, love is not all you need. You need something else as well, right? You need to be able to challenge people directly. You need to be able to, as Colin Powell says, be willing to piss people off. This is the willing to piss people off axis. Colin Powell says that leadership is often about being willing to piss people off. So why are we unwilling to piss people off, right? This starts not when we're 18 years old, but when we're 18 months old, right? From the moment, how many of you, from the moment you learn to speak, were told some version of, if you don't have anything nice to say, don't say it at all, right? Show of hands, true confession, right? So we're taught this, and now all of a sudden it's your job to say it, right? It's not just you just can't afford not to say it. That's fundamentally what you do to help the other people on your team know what they're doing right and also what they're doing wrong. And I would argue if you are in a position of some authority, if you're a manager, it's not just your job, it's actually your moral obligation. There's a great quote by John Stuart Mill in his essay on liberty about how we can't recognize often ourselves when we're wrong. And facts and data don't speak for themselves. We require each other to point this stuff out to us. So if you're in a position of some authority, it's your obligation to tell people when they're going off track. So those are the two things that make radical candor so rare that I call it radical. First of all is this tendency, especially at work, to leave the best part of yourself at home. Don't do that. Bring your whole self to work. And second of all is this fear of if you don't have anything nice to say, don't say it at all. So that's why it's radical candor. That's why it's hard. The thing that I have found that makes it much easier to counteract these two tendencies, pushing us not to be radically candid, is to think very clearly and to give clear names to what happens when we fail, right? So if you fail to care personally when you're challenging someone directly, you're being obnoxiously aggressive. This is also known as the asshole quadrant. But, in fact, I used to call it that explicitly. The reason I don't is that I really don't, this framework is not useful to put names in boxes. It's useful to judge praise and criticism because we all spend time in all of these quadrants. And in fact, I'll tell you some stories about some times when I've been in each of them. So that's sort of, and furthermore, I think that's the place where most people fear being, but it's actually second best, obnoxious aggression, right? So I said once, and
statement.
Yeah, I know it is a sad statement. I said once, if you can't offer radical candor, the second best thing you can do is be an asshole, and that got tweeted, of course, all over the place. So let me be clear. I'm not encouraging you all to be assholes. I'm just saying it can get worse. And one of the worst places you could be, and this is where actually 85% of mistakes get made, is ruinous empathy. This is where you're just trying to be nice to somebody, and so you're not telling them when they're screwing up, and so they don't fix it, and then they wind up getting fired, or in the worst case, right? So not so nice after all, right? And we've all been here, and I'll share a story about when I've been here, and I bet you all have all been here as well. And then in the very worst quadrant is manipulative insincerity. This is where toxic cultures get built. This is passive-aggressive behavior. This is political behavior. And yet, when we get in trouble for being radically candid, which 90% of the time you won't, but 10% of the time you will get in trouble for being radically candid, you're going to go zooming off to manipulative insincerity. And I'll tell a story about, or when you're obnoxiously aggressive, you get pushed. Instead of moving up on the care personally axis, you tend to pull your punches and move over to manipulative insincerity. Not you, I do it, we all do it. So those are the quadrants. Now what I'm going to do to sort of motivate the quadrants a little bit more is tell you a couple more stories, and then I'll pause for Q&A, and if you all want me to, we can just finish it off with Q&A, or I can give you some more specific examples of things you can do to put this into practice. Does that sound good? All right, so think of your own stories, because the more you tell stories, the better. When we tell each other stories, they've done fMRI studies, literally we get on the same wavelength. It's useful. It's a useful thing. Okay, so radical candor. One of the mistakes that people make about radical candor is to assume that it's safer to hang out in one of the other three quadrants until you build a relationship, and then you move over to radical candor. But actually, that's not the way it works. Good relationships start with radical candor. They don't start with ruinous empathy or any of it, certainly not with obnoxious aggression or manipulative insincerity. And it also doesn't have to take a long time. Radical candor is, the way that I want you to use this framework is more like the way that you would use a toothbrush. It's not a root canal, but if you just brush every day, hopefully you won't have to get a root canal, right? So the origin story for me of radical candor came when I was doing the first startup I mentioned earlier, Juice. I was living in New York. It was right after September 11th. My response to September 11th was a profound one. I bought a puppy. I had this golden retriever puppy, and I adored this dog. It was like my emotional life raft. And as a result, I never said a crossword to it or trained it at all, and it was completely and utterly out of control, this dog. And so I'm standing, waiting for the light to change, and the dog almost got hit by a cab. I pulled it out of the way at the very last moment and sort of stood there shocked. And this man standing next to me looked at me, and all he did to establish that he cared personally was to say, "I can see you really love that dog." Yes, he had me there. He was right. And then he said, "But you're going to kill that dog if you don't teach it to sit." So that was his direct challenge, and that got my attention. And then he looks at the ground, and he points in this sort of big gesture, and he says, "Sit." And the dog sat. I had no idea the dog knew what that meant. Like, how did the dog know what sit meant? Never sat for me. And I kind of looked at this man in shock. And he says to me, "It's not mean, it's clear." And then the light changed, and he walked off, leaving me with words to live by, right? So it just took him the time and space, didn't take any extra time out of his day to give me this incredibly valuable insight. So it doesn't have to take forever, radical candor. You don't have to know people's birthdays and the names of everyone in their family and all this kind of stuff. Those are good things, maybe, but maybe just a party trick too. You just have to take a moment to share your intention to be helpful to the person as you're giving them criticism and also praise. Equally as important with praise. So that's my quick radical candor story. Now for the time when I was an asshole. I will assert for the record that I am not a jerk generally, but I do sometimes behave like one. And I've done some research, and all of you have done the same thing at some point in your life. I behaved like a jerk. So also shortly after I joined Google, I got in a disagreement with Larry Page, one of the founders, about an AdSense policy. And so I sent this email out that said, "Larry claims he wants to organize all the world's information and make it universally accessible and useful, but if he will make a buck, he's willing to create clutter sites that muddle the world's information." Why did I do this? Why did I send such an obnoxious email? I guess, sometimes when I tell the story, people think, oh, she was being radically candid. But that wasn't radical candor. It was not helpful. It was not humble at all. I really didn't know what I was talking about. I hadn't asked enough questions. It was immediate. I'll give myself that much credit. I didn't do it in private. I didn't do it in person. And worst of all, I personalized something that didn't need to get personalized. We should have been talking about the AdSense policy, not whether or not Larry was greedy, which was irrelevant to the conversation. So that was bad. Why would I do that? I think the reason I did it, and the reason why I'll share with you why I did it, having thought about it later, is that a bunch of people whom I've advised have made the same mistake. So maybe if I tell you the story, you won't make the mistake. The problem was that I believe that, and this is not a problem, I do believe this, I believe there's a special place in hell for people who kiss up and kick down. But it doesn't mean doing the exact opposite is really so much better, right? So when you care personally, this is something you spread out in an egalitarian way to every human being you interact with, right? Up, down, or sideways. So that was my mistake. Now, the even worse mistake, as it turned out, Larry didn't really care that I sent the email. He thought it was kind of funny, in fact. But what did bug him, somebody pointed out, not him, but somebody else pointed out to me later on that I had been obnoxious. And when I looked at the email, I was like, that's right, I was kind of obnoxious. Why did I do that? But rather than moving up on the caring personally axis, I just backed off my challenge. So the next time I saw Larry, I hadn't done any more research. I didn't understand really why he was right, in fact, and I was wrong. I just told him, "Oh, I'm sorry about that email. I realize you're right and I'm wrong." But that was not really an apology. It was a lie, actually. And there were two problems. One is that I'm not a very good liar, and two is that he has a pretty good bullshit meter. So he sort of looks at me like I'm a pigeon that pooped on his shoulder, and then he walks off and it was like one of those painful moments where this guy standing next to me patted me on the shoulder and he said, he likes it better when you disagree with him, right, than the false agreement. So don't get shoved when you are occasionally obnoxious, which you will be from time to time. Don't move to an even worse place, right? Make sure you move up on the care personally axis, don't quit challenging people directly. So that was my foray into manipulative insincerity. Now, as I said before, most mistakes get made up here in the ruinous empathy quadrant. And so what I want to tell you about next is a moment in my career that was probably the worst moment of my career. So in this case, I had hired this guy, we'll call him Bob, and I liked Bob. Bob was funny, he was charming, he was quirky, he would do things. We were at one of these ridiculous management offsites where we're playing some dumb get-to-know-you game, and Bob called nonsense, and he said, let's just go around the table and let's confess to each other what candy our parents used when potty training us. Weird question, even more weird, everybody knew, Hershey Kisses. And for the next 10 months, every time there was a tense moment on the team and an argument would erupt, Bob would whip out just the right piece of candy for the right person at the right moment. So anyway, this was Bob. I felt him, maybe I'm weird, but I felt him charming. I liked Bob. So I didn't want to hurt Bob's feelings. And the problem was with Bob that he was doing terrible work. Like absolutely, in fact, I found out later the reason why his work was so bad was that he was smoking pot every day in the bathrooms a couple of times a day. Maybe that explains the candy. But anyway, I didn't know this at the time, so I kept trying to buck Bob up. You can do better, you're super smart, I know you can do this. And so giving him praise that was really just kind of a head fake. I never criticized him. Really, I just never criticized him. I was going to say as clearly as I should have, but I just didn't do it. I just wimped out of it. And after 10 months, the inevitable happened, and it became clear that if I didn't fire Bob, I was going to lose half my team. So I had the hard conversation finally with Bob, and when I'm finished, he sort of pushes his chair back, and he looks right at me, and he says, "Why didn't you tell me?" And as that question is kind of rolling around in my mind with no really good answer, he looked at me again and he said, "Why didn't anybody tell me?" So now I realize I failed Bob, and I failed him in a bunch of different ways. I failed to give him the criticism that he needed. I gave him praise that was really more of a head fake than it was anything that was helpful. I never asked him to criticize me. Maybe I was doing something to him that was driving him to toke up in the bathroom, right? Maybe I was driving him nuts. I don't know. I hadn't asked him. So I had not gotten a reciprocal challenge from him. And I had failed to create the kind of environment in which everyone would tell him when he was going off the rails. So I had failed to create an environment that encouraged radical candor. And because I had failed, I'm now firing Bob because of it. Those are the worst moments as a manager. When you realize you're learning your most important lessons on the backs of other people. But even Bob at this point agreed it was too late to fix the problem. So what I had to do was to just promise myself in a very serious way in that moment that this was not a mistake that I was going to make again. I was not going to make this mistake again. And I was going to work hard to really help everyone who I worked with not to make the mistake again. And that's really a big part of what motivates this framework for me and why I'm up here talking to you all about it right now. So why don't I pause here and take some questions. So the question is often when David gives feedback, he says, well, I do this too. You can interject if I don't get your question just right. And so the question is that a good idea, or is it better to sort of hold yourself more distant from the problem? And I think, I'd love to hear what you all think, but for my money, I think empathizing with the person, empathy is not bad, just ruinous empathy is bad, right? So expressing some connection with the person. It's a way that you show that you care personally. Of course you care personally. You've been in the person's shoes. You know why they're doing it and what they're doing. So I think it's a great idea. I don't think, my experience is that holding yourself apart as sort of more of an authority figure is not necessarily helpful. That's why I chose the word challenge directly, because a challenge implies reciprocity. If you're challenging me, you expect me to challenge you back, right? And a big part of the benefit of radical candor is that when you tell somebody if they've done something wrong, you give them the opportunity to either fix it or correct you. Maybe you're wrong. Maybe what they did isn't wrong, right? You get another perspective on it. If you praise somebody in a way that's radically candid, you give them the opportunity to do more of what's good, or actually to say, why are you talking about my shoes? Like, you should be talking about the content of my talk, right? So I think in both cases that's why it's useful, because you shouldn't expect not to get challenged. Yeah, so the question is, can you give an example of being radically candid when praising someone? In fact, I'll give an example in all 4 quadrants. So when you're radically candid, let's imagine that you come up to me after the presentation and you say specifically what you liked about the presentation. So maybe the words in the framework helped you. And then you tell me what I could do to build on that success. Like, maybe you could go talk at this place, or maybe you could use this software or something. You have something, you give me an idea, like, here's what was good and here's how you can do more of what was good. If you were obnoxiously aggressive, you probably would sort of think, I don't need to baby her ego, I'm not going to say anything to her, right? That's most often how it plays out. If you're being ruinously empathetic with your praise, you'd say, oh, that was so good, you should feel so good. Like, that doesn't really tell me much. In fact, I was interviewing a woman who had road crew, and she said, yeah, I know what you mean. Like, I really hated it when she was a coxswain. I really hated it when the rowers would come up to me afterwards and say that was a great race. Like, that doesn't tell me anything. You should feel good. That's a great race. And then the manipulative insincerity would be, you come up to me after the talk and you say, that was amazing. And then you turn to the person next to you when I'm out of earshot and you say, I would have done much better. That was actually kind of sucked. And you give, to make yourself look smart, you say all the things that sucked, but you didn't say to my face. So the question is, how do you help encourage radical candor on your team? I think the most important thing you can do is actually, if somebody has a better phrase for this, I'd be very grateful. But I always call it require joint escalation. And what I mean by that, there was one time in my career, well, there were several times in my career, where I had 2 people who hated each other who both worked for me. So let's say Charlie and Daniel were maybe they didn't hate each other, but they were not getting along. And so Charlie comes to me and talks to me about Daniel, and then Daniel comes to me and talks to me about Charlie. And rather than forcing them to go have a fight, to go work it out, challenge each other directly, I try to play shuttle diplomat, So I go to Daniel and I'm like, if you could just do this, it would make it much easier with Charlie. And then I go to Charlie and I say, if you could just do this, it would make it much easier with Daniel. And pretty soon, every time I'm talking to Charlie, Daniel's like, I bet they're talking about me. And he's right, we are. And so now they're not challenging each other directly. And they trust each other even less than they did to begin with. And just because I'm trying to empathize with them, right? I'm trying to work it out. I'm trying to avoid the fight, actually. I would have been much better off to make them go and have the fight directly, talk to each other directly, and then to say, if you can't work it out, I'll help you. It's part of my job as your boss. But you've got to come to me together. I'm not going to talk to one of you without the other one in the room. So I think that is really important. So that's one thing. I think just creating, making praise and criticism safer and more natural. Like, one of the things I used to do at both my startup and at Google was I bought 2 stuffed animals, very cheap and very effective. So One was a monkey called Whoops the Monkey, and the other was this big killer whale. You can choose whatever, it doesn't have to be a killer whale necessarily. And so I asked people to nominate themselves for Whoops the Monkey in order to explain to people that it's okay to fail. It's okay to criticize yourself, that criticism is a gift, and just to sort of create a culture of self-criticism, which then makes it much easier to criticize others. And then I encouraged people to nominate each other for this killer whale about exceptional things that had happened on the team. And it's surprising, people, even people who are really successful, it feels sort of patronizing to praise people, but it felt good to nominate them for this stuffed animal for whatever reason. And it was a little hard to get Whoops going, so I put $20 on Whoops's head. It was amazing what an effect $20 had. Not, I think, because people wanted the $20, but because it gave them kind of a, oh, I'm just doing it for the money. You know, just it made it somehow easy. I don't know why it really worked, but it did. So anyway, those are a couple of ideas. So one of the things that I always did when I was interviewing people, a couple of things. One was I would just ask them to sort of tell their story rather than drive in on any one point. And when people talk about themselves and tell their story just in an open-ended way, you often get more than you expect, because people will sort of, you sense the spin, you sense when people are, you know, this was a real mistake, when they're more honest and self-critical. So I'm sort of looking for self-criticism in the telling of the story, and then I always ask people, you know, what was the hardest feedback you ever had to give somebody, and see how they talk about it. And there's no one right answer, but you kind of get a sense of you know, whether people, if they don't have a good story about giving some really hard feedback, like then they probably haven't given enough of it, in my experience. My advice is that the very best feedback I ever got in my career always came in 1 or 2 minutes between meetings, not in one-on-one. So in general, I try to allow one-on-ones to, I try to get the employee to set the agenda for the one-on-one, and I don't save up feedback for the one-on-one. I try to give it, when I say immediate, I mean with immediate, like right after the meeting. And the reason for that is several-fold. One is that it's hard to remember for the one-on-one, and it's hard to be specific. It seems sort of awkward to wait for a one-on-one. It seems sort of artificial. Like if you had a problem with something that a friend did or a family member did, you wouldn't wait for some regularly scheduled meeting to tell them. You know, you tell them right away. And so it introduces an element of falsity to the relationship with your employee. So I would first of all say try to do it right away, right after the meeting. And then I would say that one of the best pieces of advice on this came from Andy Grove, who was the CEO of Intel, and who unfortunately recently passed away, and sort of one of the great leaders of Silicon Valley. And he was famous for getting people to tell him what they really thought, for being very open to it. And so I asked him what his secret is, and he said, you know, you'd be surprised. You think that in order to get people to tell you what they really think, you make them comfortable. But he said the exact opposite is true. You want to embrace the discomfort. So when you ask somebody to give you feedback, you put them in an awkward situation. So I'll show Connor what I mean. Can you tell me about what you think of this presentation so far?
So far I've been enjoying it.
Thank you very much. So I'm not going to actually keep pushing you. I'm not going to embrace the discomfort publicly, because that would be cruel and unusual punishment. My acronym, just of things to run through in your mind in that 1 minute to 2 minute meeting in between meetings, is first of all, be humble, right? Be open to getting feedback and response, like be open to being challenged. State your intention to be helpful. Just state it. I'm going to tell you something, not because I'm trying to be a jerk, but because I want to help. I know you care about X, Y, or Z, and I think this will help you achieve X, Y, or Z. Do it immediately, right away. Do it in person. Email, texting, etc. is a disaster. If you're managing teams that are global, use video conference. It's the second best. There's a sort of a hierarchy of medium here. Do it privately if it's criticism, publicly if it's praise. And most importantly, don't personalize. Don't make the mistake I made with Larry and make it about him. Like, keep it on the issue. There was a guy I worked with who had a reputation for being a real jerk. And he changed his whole reputation by changing one thing. He used to be in the habit of saying, "You're wrong." And he got this reputation for being a jerk. And then he started to say, "I think," slightly more humble, "that's wrong." Now it's about that, not about you. Totally turned around for him. So I think doesn't have to be super complicated. I mean, sometimes you have to like search deep inside yourself, but often it's just pretty just sort of quick and easy. Radical candor gets measured at the other person's ear, not at your mouth. And so if you're being radically candid with me, you might have to take on a pretty strong, loud tone. But if you're being radically candid with my sister, who's probably a better listener than I am, you could take on a more gentler, and you're better served taking on a more gentle tone. And that's really one of the first tool that we're building at my company, Candor, is a candor gauge. So if you're giving feedback to people on a regular basis, you send them this gauge, and they tap which quadrant they feel your praise was in and where your criticism was. So it takes them 30 seconds. The tool aggregates the feedback and then sends you a report once a week with a tip on how to improve based on where your aggregate scores were. And just seeing how the other person is taking what you're saying moves people incredibly quickly towards radical candor. Because if you go back to the 2x2, most people fear being here. They fear being obnoxiously aggressive. But if you're giving the feedback, but if you're receiving the feedback, most people fear this or this, but mostly they fear this. And so when you see that you're afraid you're punching too hard, but the people you're giving feedback to are afraid you're pulling your punches, then it becomes much easier to challenge more directly. And sometimes you'll see that you thought you had adopted the right tone, but the other person thought you were obnoxious, and then you learn how to move up on. But most often that's the dynamic. When I teach this, I sometimes do a class. It's kind of a role play on steroids. And we hire an actor to get emotional and defensive, because that's the most common way to push people towards ruinous empathy, even when it's just a role play and they've just been taught about ruinous empathy and they know they should just say it. They can't do it when the actor is tearing up or whatever. So it's hard, first of all. I think that one of the most important things you can do is not back off you can be compassionate about the emotional reaction that you're getting. You know, I can see you're upset, and I'm sorry you're upset. My goal here is not to upset you. My goal here is to help you. But don't back off your challenge. Don't say, "I'm sorry I said that," or, "Oh, it's not really that bad," because then that's often why people are kind of, even without meaning to, manipulating you with their emotions. So don't get sort of keep in your mind the 2x2 and don't move in the wrong direction on the challenge directly axis. But do think about ways that you can move up on the carrot. Be compassionate. It's very tempting to avoid conversations because you're afraid of the emotion in the conversation. One of the pieces of advice I give to people is eliminate from your vocabulary the words, the phrase, "Don't take it personally." If somebody's getting upset, they have taken it personally, and we do care about our work. Our work is deeply personal. I mean, it's natural. Don't personalize, but don't expect people not to have an emotional reaction. Use the energy from that emotional reaction to realize that you've gotten through to somebody, you need to stay firm on your challenge, but you need to move up on the care personally axis. And it's hard because a lot of the feedback is, there was one guy who I worked with who was having a hard time at work because he just stood too close to people and he made them nervous, right? He was like in their space. And I mean, there was another guy who had terrible VO, and that also really hard to say that without feeling like you're personalizing. So in those cases, one of the really helpful frameworks is situation, behavior, impact, right? So when you stand really close to somebody else, it's not that you're doing anything wrong, but they start to feel uncomfortable, and then they don't want to meet with you because they have this generic sense of discomfort. So every time you walk up to somebody and you're talking to them, just learn to take a step back, I had to say to this guy. And he was a little bit offended at first, but when he sort of saw it, and I had to point it out to him a few times, he realized that. I said, I'm not telling you this because I think you're a bad person or because I think you're annoying or because everybody thinks you're annoying. This is a very simple thing to fix. Like, just take a step back. Take one step back. Just realize that this is what happens. So, it's not helpful. There was another guy I was coaching, and I said, you got to challenge this person directly. And he said, yeah, I'm just going to go tell her that I don't trust her and I can't stand working with her. And I was like, whoa. That's not really so helpful, right? So there's a fine line in these things, but I think you'll find it. Because especially as a good manager, you're going to have to criticize people not just for their work product, but their work style, because you got to keep a team of people working well together. All right. Thank you very much.